Okay, welcome everyone. Looks like we're getting everybody together here. Welcome for another episode or webinar of fermentology. Just give everyone a few more seconds here. We're at 4:01 Eastern Time. All right, great. I say let's get this show on the road. All right, welcome everybody. Thanks again for tuning in to another fermentology. My name is Michelle Jewell, as some of you may know by now, and I'm based here at NC State's Department of Applied Ecology in Raleigh, North Carolina. And I'll just go ahead and give you an extra note that Raleigh today is expecting some storms. I think we're in the clear. I think we'll get the webinar in before the real bad weather hits, but if we go dark suddenly during the webinar, it's probably because we've lost power. So apologies in advance if that happens. But aside from that, as you know, this is Fermentology. It's our semi-weekly-ish mini seminar series on the culture, science, and the history of everyday fermented foods. And we've had guests from all over the world join us since April. This is, I think, our 25th webinar. So if you've been here for all 25, good on you. I know I have been. And if you haven't caught all 25 and you want to catch up, all the recordings of the talks are available on our YouTube page, and that link I'll send around as well. But today, we have a very special guest. As part of our March Meadness, Jereme Zimmerman is going to be joining us. He's an author, brewer. He's going to walk us through some of the history and the process of making mead like the Vikings did. So hopefully by the end of this, I know Jeremy's got a few recipes he's going to share with us and a few processes. So maybe we can get out there, get some pounds of honey and make our own mead. We will have a live Q&A at the end of the talk, as always. So as you have questions, whether you're in the YouTube stream or if you're in the Zoom room, you can put those questions in the Q&A or chat box, whichever you see in front of you. And I will ask a few questions at the end for Jeremy if we've got a bit of time. But I unfortunately won't be able to get to everybody's. And without any further ado, Jeremy, if you'd like to come on screen and share your screen, we'll get going.
There I am. Okay, let me get my PowerPoint shared here. Hopefully, we won't have any technical difficulties with this. I think I need to get it going full screen.
Perfect. That's it.
All right, we can see everything?
Yep, looks great.
All right, good to go. I'll go ahead and get going on this. I'm going to cover a lot of the basics of what I've learned in my research here. Won't be able to go real in depth, but I can answer some questions at the end and some Q&A. I'll provide my contact information at the end as well if people want to follow up afterwards. So my first book was titled "Make Mead Like a Viking," and that's what a lot of my presentations end up being titled. So I will talk about kind of Nordic, Scandinavian brewing, both mead and a tiny bit of beer. But honestly, when I started researching this, I found there was really no hard evidence as to exactly how the Vikings made mead. So a lot of what I learned actually went back from Viking Bronze Age times all the way back to ancient Neolithic times to kind of get some ideas of how all ancient peoples did mead and brewing. And so I'll kind of cover a little bit of all of that. And I'm just going to go ahead and get into that and talk about that a little bit. So it's Make Mead Like a Viking. Should be subtitled Make Mead as close to as what we think we know the way the Vikings might have made mead. That didn't work quite as well for a book title though. So a quick just rundown of what mead is, because not everyone necessarily knows right off the bat. And really it's just a fermented honey water alcoholic drink. Doesn't necessarily have to be super alcoholic depending on how much honey and how long it's fermented. But especially by modern definitions, that's essentially what mead is. Any alcohol needs a sugar to ferment. Wine uses grapes and other fruits and sometimes some extra sugar. Beer uses malted grains. There's a whole process to get the sugar from those grains. Mead is the easiest and very likely the most ancient, simply because it doesn't really take a lot to actually make it ferment. It will ferment on its own using wild yeast. And there's a little extra help you can give it to make it ferment a little, make it ferment longer and more alcohol into all kinds of different flavors. There's a lot of stuff you can do to help it along, but really, literally, nature will do most of the work for you, and then you can kind of mess with it how you want. So I'll talk about the process a little bit further along here. Again, by modern definitions, especially if we're talking commercial mead, honey has to be the primary fermentable sugar. I don't know the exact percentage because it varies a little bit, but 90-ish% is probably a good bet. And again, you can combine it with other sugars, and I'll talk about that a little further on. Just regular straight up table sugar, cane sugar, if you're doing this at home, and some other things to make some kind of beer wine hybrids, beer mead hybrids sort of things. And you can flavor it with pretty much anything. I mean, if it's edible, it's something that you can make into meat or brew into beer or even use in wine. There are some things you may not want to use. There are some things you might want to be a little extra careful about. But again, if it's edible, you can probably put it into your mead. And it's about as ancient as it gets, simply because anywhere there has been honey, there has been somebody who has made mead. A lot of times, very likely, especially the first couple times they discover it by accident. It will spontaneously ferment if it's left to open air, mixed in with some water. It's full of all kinds of microbes and yeasts and a whole bunch of stuff that's actually dormant in honey, which is why honey is such a great preservative. But it gets a little bit of water in it, either intentionally or by accident. Before you know it, it'll start fizzing, and give it a little time, it'll start producing a little alcohol. Early on, it produces a lot of kind of nice probiotic benefits. So it was actually used a lot of times as a medicinal sort of a thing, both so people would enjoy it both for flavor and for intentionally incorporating herbs and various things that they knew had a medicinal effect, or even hallucinogenic. There's a lot of early research that shows that various hallucinogenic herbs and mushrooms and all that kinds of things were used. Some people theorize that might have been what caused the Viking berserkers to go into their berserking rage before battle. They might have incorporated some herbs and mushrooms that had psychotropic properties, or even properties that we now consider toxic, but might not have killed them, but it might have kind of driven them a little crazy temporarily, possibly long-term as well. A lot of this stuff is sort of, we know some of it for sure. Other stuff we just kind of know from conjecture. There's a lot of stuff in the Icelandic sagas and a lot of things that had been written or passed down orally where we can kind of make some educated guesses. Fortunately, there's also been a lot of archaeological and anthropological research and all kinds of stuff where we're getting more and more of an idea as to what both Viking and Bronze Age people and early on, much earlier, incorporated into their meads and other alcoholic beverages. Just some small samples of some research that I've covered here. There's a lot more, but I'm not going to take this presentation going into a lot of in-depth research, although a lot of what I know is based on a lot of this research. But yeah, we can go all the way back to Neolithic Europe, Africa as well, lots of other parts of the world, and we're finding more and more evidence that as long as humans have been around, they have figured out ways to make alcohol both from honey, but also from fermented grains and any type of sugar they could really get a hold of. As far as, the more I got into trying to figure out how the Vikings actually made mead, the more it sounded like it was really a luxury for them. In Norwegian countries, Nordic countries in general, and the cold areas, there might not necessarily have been honeybees, or they might not have really had enough time to produce enough honey to really make a good mead. So the mead they drank might very well have been imported or made from imported honey. So straight honey water, mead, and wine as well would have been reserved for the nobility. The word mead is used a lot in Icelandic sagas and a lot of other Nordic storytelling. But if you go back to the etymology of it, a lot of times they actually might have been referring to ale. but their mead and their ale and anything they drank as a boozy type substance could very well have been a combination of all those things. It could have been a grain-based beer with a certain amount of honey in it as well, and just whatever else they could put in there to flavor it and to provide sugars to boost the alcohol level. There is an earlier talk that we did for Mead Madness, Neil Rush, if I'm saying that right, from South Africa. He's found evidence that as far back as the Middle Stone Age, people were basically just combining honey and water in rock cavities, and just like basically finding a bowl in a rock, mixing in some honey and water, and then give it a little bit of time, it ferments. Possibly, they also did in a lot of gourds and all that kind of thing. And again, it was very likely mixed in with a lot of different things. And that far back, they didn't necessarily have a way to do long-term fermentation to boost alcohol levels. And so they would have just drank it while it was fermenting, while the flavoring things were still floating in it. A lot of cultures used just straws to kind of poke in the surface where all the stuff would float to the top during fermentation, and would drink it communally that way. So yeah, all kinds of interesting, fun stuff if you dig into this a lot. But I'm going to get into the actual making a mead and touch a little bit on mostly focusing on how you can make it at home using kind of simple home-based techniques. And excuse me, just a moment here. Popped up some Q&A. I'll answer questions in it. And yeah, feel free, if there are any questions you have in there, I'll get to them at the end. There's a good chance I may cover what you're asking while I'm talking here, maybe not. But for now, let's go into the types of mead you can make. It really varies quite a bit. A lot of people who don't know a lot about mead or just getting into it assume it's sweet because it's made out of honey, or maybe they just don't really know what it's supposed to taste like. Asking what mead tastes like is a lot like asking what beer tastes like or what wine tastes like. It can vary quite a bit. It can go anywhere from a really bone dry, almost champagne-like sparkling mead to, on the other end, a very sweet, almost dessert-like sort of a mead, to somewhere in between. You got a little dry, you got a little sweet, and anywhere along that spectrum. A lot of that depends on how much honey you put into it, what types of other fermentables you put in. If you put a bunch of honey and you get enough yeast, the right kind of yeast where it ferments all the way out, then you'll have a really dry, high alcohol champagne-like mead. You can use less honey to make a lower alcohol mead. The less honey might make it a little bit more dry, not necessarily. Sometimes yeast plays an effect in that. There's a lot of different options there. But as far as modern terms, we have a couple different ways we refer to the types of mead that we have. There's actually a very long list, especially if you want to go into making it for like competitions and stuff. It gets really technical as far as the names, but really it's just a couple basic categories. The first one is show mead or traditional mead. Show mead was just came up with for home brewing competition. It's your basic honey water yeast. There might be some other smaller amounts of ingredients to kind of boost fermentation, to help nutrients, to help move things along. Very small amounts of things, acids and tannins for balancing flavor. But the main flavoring component is really just the honey. Any kind of a fruit mead is a melomel, although there's a whole list of additional terms. If you use apples, it becomes a cyser, C-Y-S-E-R. A lot of extra stuff like that. But it's just really what you just want to think about it as is just the categories. So your basic honey water mead, fruit mead, melomel, herbs, spices, flowers, pretty much any kind of, if you're an herbalist especially, and know some flavoring and medicinal benefits of herbs, definitely take advantage of that. By spices, I do mean like you can use actual spicy peppers to make a mead, but also cinnamon, cloves, all that kind of thing. That is a metheglin, which actually comes from a Welsh word that's something along the lines of medeglin, which is where we get medicine. So I mentioned that mead was made historically for medicinal purposes. That's where we get that term. You can really make some nicely flavored meads using herbs. if some can actually be particularly strong in flavor, say like really bitter, mugwort would be an example. You can intentionally do extra along those lines if you want a strong medicinal benefit, but a smaller amount will give you that. Really, most people, if they're making mead, they're doing it for the flavor. So a lot of fruits, you can really overdo it and not really worry about it too much. Spices, herbs, use pretty small amounts. And just a huge list of other things: vegetables, mushrooms, peppers. Again, if it's something you want to, if there's something you can eat, you can probably brew with it. I have an example in my book of a shiitake mushroom garlic mead, which sounds awful to drink. It can be if I make it intentionally with a bunch of those ingredients, and I usually use that actually for cooking to base meats in and stuff. A very small amount, you hardly actually taste those, you just get kind of a subtle effect. So ginger is another thing where if you really like ginger, you can use a lot of it, make a really ginger flavored mead or beer. Or you can just use a little bit just to get kind of a subtle touch. Another one that's one of my favorites, because I'm also a beer brewer, is braggot. Sometimes it's spelled with two G's. Historically, it was spelled all kinds of ways, Bracket. But it's basically a beer with a bunch of honey in it. It's somewhere between a beer, wine, and a mead. And it doesn't necessarily have to have hops. Historically, it had a lot of different herbs in it, sometimes hops, sometimes not. Hops really are more of a 15th century on is when we really started to use a lot of hops in beers. Before that, sometimes they were used, sometimes they weren't. And I mentioned show meads, traditional meads, having very small amounts of additional ingredients. If you go to a homebrewer store, you'll find, usually in the winemaking section, acids, tannins, and nutrients. You can buy those in just basically a powdered form. Those will work just fine, but they all occur in nature. By acids, we're usually talking citric acid. Lemon juice is pretty common, but any citrus will work for that. Just a very small amount to kind of balance the acid in the honey and to balance the overall flavor. Same with tannins. Tannin, an example, is grape wine. Well, not all wine is grape wine, but red wine with grapes, the skins provide the tannin. And that's where you get that little bit of extra kind of chewy mouthfeel. One of those things that can be overdone. It's not really all that pleasant to have a mead or a wine with too much tannin, but the right amount of tannins and acids, just very small amounts, will balance things out nicely. Nutrients, again, you can buy it in all different forms at homebrew stores. Really, it's just a little something extra for the yeast to feed on. If you just, especially with a show mead, traditional mead, if you just dump a bunch of honey and water and throw in some yeast, they may get stressed and not fully ferment or produce some unpleasant flavors. The extra nutrients just give the yeast something extra to feed on to have a healthy fermentation. Really, any of those braggot or any of the metheglins or melomel, any of that extra stuff you're throwing in usually works well enough for a nutrient that you don't need to add it in any of those. You can add fairly small amounts of them, including bits of the hive. Historically, a lot of the times the beekeepers would just drop the hive, even dead bees and all, just a bunch of that stuff in, and all that stuff would give the yeast something extra to feed on. If you can buy bee pollen, if you're not a beekeeper, bee pollen is another example. Various different things that you can do with that. So just real quick here, I know there's a lot of words up on this. Again, at the end here, I'll put up my website. I have PDFs with all this information, and I'm all over pretty much every social media except maybe TikTok. I'm not on there doing Viking dances or anything yet. Probably won't be. But most other social media, just look up my name and you'll find me. But I always like to provide at least a basic blueprint recipe in my talks here. And this is for a 1 gallon. 1 gallon is the best to start with. A lot of meat makers mostly make 1 gallons. When you go to a homebrew store, you'll usually find 1 gallon or 5 gallons. So on the bottom right here, I've got examples of both. And if you really want to beef things up, you can, depending on the vessel you find, you can do a lot more than that. But 1 gallon is especially a good way to experiment with these kind of funky, wild, ancient type meads. So again, I mentioned that the amount of honey and water can vary quite a bit. But for your blueprint, Usually I buy a quart jar. I'm going to buy a quart jar of honey is about 2.5 to 3 pounds. And that will produce somewhere between a semi-sweet and a sweet. To 1 gallon of spring water. And I mentioned spring water, you just want good quality water. Tap water will work. Just make sure you dechlorinate it first, run it through a filter, set it out overnight for the chlorine to evaporate, boil it and cool it down. And basically so about a quart of honey to a gallon of water. And I use organic raisins, organic specifically, so they don't have sulfites or anything in it that might inhibit fermentation. Pretty much any other dried fruit will work, elderberries. You're going to do a fairly small amount. I just take like a fingerful, which is about 10 to 12. Some mead makers really prefer to use the store-bought nutrient. There's a lot of different options there. You don't need a whole lot of it. You get into modern home brewing, mead making recipes, and there's a lot of complexity when it comes to adding nutrients and a whole lot of stuff like that. If you want to go that route, that's great if you want to get really technical about it. But historically, people were just mixing a bunch of stuff together, figured out how things worked for them and went with it. And a lot of modern mead makers too, just, we have a certain parameters we go by, but if we're going by the kind of ancient method, we just, we don't go a little overly crazy with all the technical aspects of it. So just a pinch of lemon juice I'll put in. That's maybe like half a teaspoon per gallon. Again, you don't really need a whole lot of it to kind of balance things out. Number 4 is a step. It's basically optional. If you don't want to do a straight honey water yeast traditional mead, then just add very small amounts to start to experiment with of herbs, spices, anything is edible and tasty. Again, don't dump a whole bunch in without knowing what you're doing, because some things, especially certain herbs, can really make a powerful flavor. Or just go by a recipe that has specific. This isn't really meant to be a specific recipe, more of a starter to give you an idea of what all the different things you can play around with. As far as yeast, there's a huge amount, maybe not a huge amount, but there's a lot of different types of yeast you can buy at homebrew websites, stores, or just at your grocery store. You can make mead with bread yeast. Bread yeast has some extra bacteria in it that might give it a little bit of a funky flavor. I don't mind that funkiness. I don't find it all that funky. Some people say it makes it taste a little bready or a little yeasty. I'm fine with that. Don't notice it all that much. But the main thing I'm going to talk about here is how to get a wild fermentation going, which is how people initially did it before they figured out how to save their own yeast, and then all the way up to what we do now, where most mead makers who make mead will use wine yeasts. There aren't a whole lot of actual mead yeast out there, but wine is pretty similar to mead in the process. So you can use the wine yeast if you want to do a commercial yeast. Lower alcohol meads, you can actually make what's called a session mead using either bread yeast or beer yeast. For wild yeasts, this is kind of similar to what Neil talked about in his talk with making mead from that people did in the hollowed out rocks. You can kind of emulate this process at home using, I've got a crock here. This is one of my dad's old winemaking crocks. He used to make wine. And so you can use ceramic crocks. If you buy one from an antique store, make sure you do a lead test. Some of the older ones had lead glazes on them. You can use glass. A lot of the stuff you can buy in modern homebrew stores are glass, and plastic as well. Plastic works just fine. You can buy a plastic brewing bucket or just use something you have, as long as you know it's something that was designed to be food grade, food safe, and that it hasn't been used for anything else. So don't just grab a random bucket that you don't know what it's been used for. But if you want to get a little more close to how the ancients did it, a ceramic crock is a good way to kind of start without going into being really crazy and trying to build your own ancient equipment. So really all I do to start a wild fermentation, again, I mentioned that especially if you're using a raw honey, you want to use it, you want to know where it comes from, get it from a local beekeeper, get your own. If you just buy random honey from the grocery store, it may or may not be fully natural raw honey. It may very well have additional things in it that you might not want in your mead. So just get good raw natural honey that you can trust. And the two things that will cause three things actually that will cause help with the wild fermentation are adding the water to hydrate the honey, to bring out the yeasts and microbes and stuff that exist naturally in the honey. When you mix it up together, you give it a really good stir. So aeration is another thing. The other way to aerate, once you've given it a good stir, on the upper right here, or the two right pictures here, you can see I put a cheesecloth. So a cheesecloth or a dish towel, anything porous, set that over it. And that, a good wide mouth open vessel is good. That allows, it keeps things from falling and you don't want to fall into it, for one thing. But it also just allows air flow to get in there. And wild yeast that pretty much anywhere you go, especially during the spring and summertime near a garden or orchard, it's all around us. So wild yeast will it's microscopic. It'll drop through that cheesecloth into there. And what I've got in the middle here is a tej. It's an Ethiopian mead. It's actually basically Ethiopia's national drink. And you have to hunt to find this. I knew somebody from Ethiopia brought some back, but floating in there are a bunch of these little sticks and leaves called gesho. That's a tree that they use in their mead. It's also called woody hops. It's not at all like hops, other than that it provides a bittering. So that was just one of my early attempts at making a kind of an ancient style of mead that is still made today in Ethiopia. And I gave it a good stir, covered it up. At least a couple times a day, you want to keep taking that lid off, stir it really good, cover it up again, keep it somewhere fairly warm. This works a lot better in the spring and summer. About 70 degrees or so Fahrenheit is a good temperature to keep it at. And usually in 3 to 5 days, you'll stir it, or you'll just come and look at it and it'll be fizzy and foamy, and you'll know that you have a fermentation. And as far as you can do this, I've got an example here. I'm doing a full 5 gallon. You can do the full amount of honey and water you're going to have in the final recipe, or you can do like I've done in the bottom right here. Well, I'll go out, especially in the springtime, and gather bits of wild violets and dandelion, mix some honey and water, a little bit of maybe lemon juice in just a quart or pint jar, stir it up really good, do the exact same thing with it as I did with the 5 gallon batch. Only once it starts fermenting, I now have a starter that I can use for a future mead. And you only need about really half a cup of that per gallon. A cup is safer. If you don't plan on using it for anything else, just dump the full amount in and then add your other ingredients. That will be fine too. But if you want to save it for a future batch, just put a lid on it, put it in your refrigerator. Refrigeration really slows down fermentation pretty much to a standstill. When you're ready to use it again, bring it out, set it somewhere warm. So a lot of different options there. And what I have here is a video where I went ahead and I'd started a 1 gallon tej with some gesho, where I've shown what it will look like once it starts fermentation. And here I am kind of talking in the video a little bit, but I've got to mute it for now. What I may do is skip to the end. You may or may not be able to hear it, but basically once I stir it, first you'll see that it'll kind of start getting fizzy and foamy. Some fermentations will show a lot more activity, but it's releasing a lot of CO2. So you'll know you have an active fermentation when it fizzes, and you'll hear it just kind of fizzing up like you just opened a pop bottle or something like that. But it is fizzing, and you can probably see there are more bubbles coming up. Some of these will be a lot more active. You might see bits of foam rise up. Some wild ferments get really excited, but this one's not bad. You notice I've also got some wild violets in there, probably some yarrow floating around that I pulled in from my yard to get additional wild yeast. That's all it takes to get a wild ferment going. So there you have it. I popped through a lot of the basics here because we don't have a whole lot of time, and I want to give time for questions. So any of this, I'm happy to sit here and answer questions, go into more detail on any of it. If there happen to not be a lot of Q&A questions, then I'll throw a few more things out there. But I think for now, I'll kind of let Michelle jump in and let me know how she'd like to proceed.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jereme. We do have a question now, and I'll pause a little bit for everybody at home if you want to throw your questions in the YouTube chat or in the Q&A for Zoom. But we can start here with Sue, who has a question about if your honey's already crystallized. Is that something we can use?
Yeah, I got the Q&A up too, so I can see them as well. Yes, actually, that means that it's a good honey to use. So basically, a good raw natural honey will actually crystallize naturally, especially if it gets cold. So that means that it hasn't really had a lot of extra filtering done to it. It just means it's a good honey. Sometimes that takes a little extra work. The best way to do that, one thing I didn't really talk a lot about is temperature in mead making. If you happen to be a beer brewer, there's a fair amount of boiling and cooking involved. You just pretty much want it to be nice, warm, basically body temperature. So if your honey is crystallized, the best way to get it ready for mead is to either warm your water up to just not boiling, but fairly warm. Either warm it up first, blend it in like that, or sometimes if I have a jar of honey that's crystallized or that is maybe not crystallized but still pretty thick, I'll warm up a pot of water, turn the heat off, and then kind of set the jar in the water and let that warm. So short answer, yes, you can definitely use crystallized honey, and it's one of the better types of honey to use.
Nice. Okay, good. I've got a lot of crystallized honey. Not 2.5 pounds, but plenty. Another really good question here from both Andrew and Haley here. How long do you set it to ferment usually?
Yeah, and that's one of those, when I do my longer classes, I can go in a little more detail on that, but it's also one of those questions that there are a lot of answers to. So it depends on what part of the process, what type of mead you're making. So to go to the very beginning, say you're making a wild ferment or you're just adding your own commercial yeast, that will take a couple days to about a week to really start fermenting. And at that point, it's fermenting, it's still pretty sweet, it's maybe slightly alcoholic. And like historically in a lot of the ancient mead making, they would start drinking it. In Tej, for example, they just leave it open fermented. And over time, it becomes less sweet and more alcoholic. And then if it's left in that open fermentation, it starts to become sour. So I'm digressing a little bit, but that's an example of how, over about a month, they might drink it over time. If you want to bottle it, then say a semi-sweet mead, which is about that 2.5 to 3 pounds per gallon of water, it will take maybe a month or two to really ferment to the full amount of alcohol, but it's going to take another month or two to really fully ferment to where you can feel safe bottling it. Because if you bottle too soon with all that CO2, you potentially got corks popping, bottles exploding can happen, but only if you, go, don't wait for too long.
Right.
So really, my short answer to that is always 1 week to 5 years.
Right.
1 week to 5 years for drinking. So right. With a really basic kind of ancient style mead, you can start sipping on it whenever. If you want to really fully ferment a high alcohol mead and bottle it, those usually benefit from time in the bottle. So yeah, to fully ferment a session mead is another one I mentioned. If you're using less honey to make more of a beer-like mead, those can pretty much be fully fermented and drinkable in under a month. Other ones can take a few months. It just depends on the amount of honey. Amount of honey primarily is what it depends on. And some yeasts ferment honey faster than others.
Sure. I imagine it probably has something to do with temperature as well, right? If you're trying to ferment this in the dead of winter in Michigan, that might take a bit longer.
Yeah, as long as you're keeping it near like a heater vent or something like that, or next to if you're keeping it somewhere where it's nice and warm. But even doing that, I do find that meads on fermenting in the winter can take a little longer. I've got to be a little more patient with them. And that should also mention that 70-ish degrees a little higher, closer to 80 Fahrenheit is ideal.
Mhm.
If you really let it, high temperatures can potentially cause flavors you don't like. If you let it sit somewhere like 90 to 100 degrees to ferment. Again, that also depends a little bit on yeast. There's a Norwegian yeast called Kvike that's mostly for beer that you can use with mead that prefers 90 to 100 Fahrenheit.
Mm.
So it will ferment at warmer temperatures. If you let it go too cold, say 50 degrees Fahrenheit or below, it's basically going to sit there and be dormant until you get it warm again.
Right. And that's a good follow-up question from Jeff here. He's asking, how do you stop that fermentation to make the sweet mead? I assume that's when you bottle it, chill it, halt it in its tracks.
Let's see. Sorry, I shouldn't have been looking at the questions while you were answering. What was the question on that one again?
How you stop the fermentation. So you've got it to a stage that it's nice and sweet, or however you like it. How do you get it to put the brakes on?
Well, that is a tough one to answer. It's not really tough to answer. There are just some options available, and it depends on how technical you want to be and how much patience you have. So in general, I'm doing the more kind of ferment and wait kind of thing. Again, some yeasts, sometimes depending on the amount of honey, if you use a good amount of honey, eventually it'll just like the yeast will just be like, okay, I'm done. Mm-hmm. And you'll have some residual sweetness. I pretty much have a fairly good idea of how sweet or dry I want mine to be in the end, and adjust my recipe accordingly, and just watch it and let it go. Mm-hmm. And I've kind of by instinct, I generally know when it's done, but you can also tell when it's really clarified, when it's really still, you don't see any kind of CO2 bubbles, then it's done or mostly done. Sometimes it looks like it's done, but it's not. To test that, there's a brewing piece of equipment called a hydrometer that tests the gravity. So when there's high gravity, when you first do it, because of all that heavy honey, when it ferments out, it's low. So, but as far as just stopping it, there are things you can buy at homebrew stores. Calcium, I can't remember exactly what it is because I don't really use it. There's like kind of sulfite sort of thing where, and even with those, sometimes they don't fully stop. So, but one other thing that a lot of people try if it's cold out or if you have space in a refrigerator is cold crashing, and that's kind of like lagering a beer, which is fermenting cold. Kind of. But cold crashing is basically when it's close to being done, you like the flavor, stick it somewhere really cold for a few days, maybe not in a full-on freezer, but 30 degrees or so Fahrenheit, maybe not much lower than that. And that will kind of basically freeze what yeast is left. They'll drop down, it'll clarify more. But fully stopping fermentation is not always a super easy thing to do. So I mostly just exercise patience.
Right. And a really good follow-up to that too from Andrew is, so once you have it, it's at the level that you like, how do you store it? What's the best way that you go about that?
Well, I guess it sounds like we might be talking about once it's been bottled. So, right. Yeah. So again, when it's fermenting, keep it somewhere warm, and you can actually, it'll take a little longer, but you can intentionally ferment it somewhere a little cooler. Some people do that, especially people who make cider. So you can ferment it a little cooler, but that's not really what the question was. As far as like where I put it once it's ready, once it's been bottled, I have a basement, so I can cellar it. So basically somewhere like cellar temperature, if you can. If you live in an apartment or whatever, don't really quite have that. Just find a cool spot of your house, even just like a closet or a pantry or something, kind of set somewhere in the back. Direct sunlight over time will, even if it's not somewhere hot, that will actually affect the flavor. So you want it just somewhere cool and dark. And always, no matter how careful you are with bottling, I still always put it like in a box, covered up with something. Mm-hmm. Sometimes fermentation is unpredictable, and maybe I'll have a weak bottle, or it'll just ferment more than I expected in the bottle. And so just be prepared. I've heard stories about people hiding their meat off somewhere in a closet and then the cork pops or they actually have an explosion or something, and there's a
Yikes. A
mess.
mead bomb. Nobody wants a mead bomb.
It can happen, if you do it long enough, or if you're just careful, it won't. But it's always good to just kind of put it in a box, covered box somewhere, nice and cool, and forget about it for a while.
Nice. And Tyler here is also curious. What's your favorite mead?
Yeah, it's another one that's always tough to. So because I'm a beer brewer, honestly, my personal favorites are either braggots, meads. I mentioned that are basically beer with honey in it, so it's kind of a beer mead sort of a thing, and session meads, which kind of lower alcohol, about a beer level, so they can be anywhere from like 5 to 7%, and they're usually a little fizzy. A lot of meads are flat, but I do also, occasionally as kind of a treat, will like more of a higher alcohol, 10, 12, or even higher percent. It's a tough one. Metheglins, a lot of metheglins, I think, for my more wine-like higher alcohol meads. And metheglins can have tons of different flavors in them, but usually I make like a spiced metheglin. So I'll do things like cinnamon, cloves, all that sort of thing. And that's a good one to drink in the winter, especially. And sometimes I'll make a kind of a hot toddy out of it, or I'll warm it up and do a mulled mead. So
nice.
Those are probably at the top of my list, I guess.
Awesome. Well, Jereme, again, thank you. And as I fortunately don't want to take all the time, I do want to plug our next talk as well while I still have everybody. We've talked about all the sweet this month. We're going to be talking about the sour coming April. April 1st is going to be with Rob Dunn. He's going to be talking about his latest research, looking into the evolution of sour taste. How did we start enjoying sour stuff, and how that acquired taste maybe helped us along with creating more fermented foods and consuming more fermented foods. So don't miss that one. That's April 1st. And I'm going to be sending out an email to everybody because there are loads of talks coming up in April within the fermentology series and outside of the fermentology series, all having to do with sour stuff. So until next time, and again, Jereme, on behalf of everybody, thank you so much for your time. And yeah, look forward to see you next time.
Yeah, thank you. It's been fun. Sorry I couldn't quite get to all the questions, but people can feel free to look me up online if they can find me.
Awesome.
Thank you, Barb.
Thank you so much.